Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Crystal Field-Sam, and I have the pleasure of being a board member of AFP-NYC, and I'm the incoming chair of our IDEA committee, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Committee. It is with great honor and pleasure that I welcome you to the event today. This is a joint event that we're hosting with our Professional Advancement Committee. And you are in store for a fantastic event. We are talking about fundraisers of color, why they're important, why they are the future, and the relevance to your organization. Today, you'll be walking away with some actionable ideas, and you will be also able to speak to our panelists, who I'll introduce a little bit later today. At this time, we have prepared a fantastic video to just talk a bit more about this event and really set the stage for what we really hope is going to be something that is lively, enjoyable, welcoming, and open for discussion. With that being said, I'd like to have us start with our video.
After coming off a summer of racial injustice and seeing that we need to all be part of the solution, it's really important upon us to be able to provide tools for fundraisers of color so that not only can they advance their own careers individually, but also promote those organizations that have long served underrepresented communities.
Advancing the careers of fundraisers of color will make the biggest impact on philanthropy by allowing voices that are varied to move into leadership positions, which impact how the story of the organization is told and how philanthropists are introduced to the issues and the direct service of the organization.
Our group was founded on the principles of fundraising innovation, and we know that innovation can't happen in a homogeneous environment. It needs diversity of thought and purpose, background and experience. And so we set out a few years ago to really diversify the sector and our approach to the work.
I think a significant problem for people of color accessing the fundraising sector is the lack of paid internships. I know many of us, myself included, benefited from unpaid internships, and it was our opportunity to get much valued experience and a foothold into the fundraising profession. But that is definitely not the case, especially now for a cross-section of people, particularly people of color.
The immediate change that we'll see in philanthropy as a result of these efforts is greater diversification of our boards. We know our boards have the greatest impact on our fundraising abilities, and so having more diversity and representation at that level will completely change how nonprofits can serve their representative communities.
I think fundraisers can do a lot to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion now, because we need to remember our roles as the ones who raise the money for our nonprofits. And we know that money and other resources help drive the programming to advance our missions. So if we apply the same role that we have in wielding those resources to talking and advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we can finally see some of the changes that we've been talking about for years, including greater diversity in the highest levels of our nonprofits, and especially in terms of diversity of our boards.
On behalf of the New York City chapter of AFP, I invite you to be part of the solution to promote diversity in philanthropy. If you're not a member, I encourage you to become one. If you are a member, I'd encourage you to become even more involved. For us, it's the time to affect change.
Wonderful. I hope you enjoyed hearing from a few of us about why today is important and how important we feel the idea of diversity and inclusion is to not only the fundraising profession, but hopefully to the successful running and operation of your organization. At this time, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our fantastic sponsors. We would like to thank the OR Group, as you see here, the nonprofit Master of Science from Columbia University, Uuman Consulting, and DM Pros. Thank you so much for your support of this event. Now, we'd like to talk about a few ways to make sure that you enjoy the event in full. Wonderful. So to engage with us, please make sure that your mic is muted. Please mute yourself. It's very important for the flow of the event. Please take this time to also turn off your video. And then you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, if you click the arrows to the side of the icons, it'll give you the options, and then you can scroll through the menu on how to do that. Please let us know if you have any issues with that. Also, we'd like to direct you to use the chat for any questions that you may have. And then for your reactions, we'd love for you to be able to let us know how you're feeling about what's being said. And if you click the reactions button on the right-hand side, then you will be able to let us know if you would like to offer applause, a thumbs up, if you loved something, or if it was funny and engaging. Again, if you have any questions about any of these requests, please let me know. And also, please be able to put your screen on speaker view so that you'll be able to see who's speaking at the time that they are engaging you as an audience. With that being said, I'd like to go over the overview of what is going to happen today. We are going to have a fantastic panel discussion led by Dr. Rasan Harris, who is the CEO of Citizens Community for New York City. We are going to have a Q&A. We will have help from fantastic Craig, who you may see or may not see, but you definitely will hear, who will be able to read off any of the questions that you put in the chat. We'll have closing and final remarks. And then I'm also very excited to tell you about a breakout session that we are going to have in which you can network, be able to speak with our panelists and speakers and people who helped organize the event, such as myself and some of the other AFP members from both committees, Professional Advancement and IDEA, will also be in the room in case you wanted to ask us any questions about AFP as well. Fantastic. So I have the distinct honor and pleasure of letting you know who you will be hearing from today, in addition to Rasan. We will be having Angelique Grant, who is a senior consultant and VP at the Aspen Leadership Group on our panel, as well as Eric Ellis, who's the president and CEO of Integrity Development, and Rita Walters, who's the VP of Development and Alumni Relations at Union Theological Seminary. Welcome all. Please feel free, as I mentioned, to direct all of your questions directly, in the chat. And with that being said, I don't know if you can tell my excitement by my smile, but I tell you, you are in for a total treat. I'd like to now direct and turn over the event to Rasan.
Thank you, Crystal, and hello, everyone. What a time to be in. It is a world and a society that we're all just kind of wrapping our arms around. We're in the midst of twin pandemics. We have coronavirus that has caused us to pause, but we've also recognized that racial and social justice needs our attention based off of what's happening in society. And it makes it extremely interesting environment for nonprofits. How do you effectively raise money in this moment? How do you make sure that your organization is having the impact? Because raising money and not knowing exactly why and how and articulate why it's important is occupational hazard in normal times. In a time when folks are thinking about scarcity and uncertainty, being able to show them that they're investing in something that's going to have a huge impact is vitally important. And in the midst of these twin pandemics, it's extremely important for us to make sure that we're utilizing all the resources that are available and actually to reimagine the way we do work, because the future is upon us. And I'm really excited that we're having this conversation about diverse philanthropy, about fundraising that utilizes all of our assets and orienting ourselves in a way that allows all of us to participate in the betterment of society and the communities that we're trying to impact. So we have an amazing panel. When we had our prep call, we talked about issues of, how are we coming to this conversation? Is this just about race? Is this just for the initiated? Is it just for folks who really understand and have the language? And the answer is, we're all in this together. You don't have to be an expert to have a stake in the game. And it's really important for us to really take the 50,000 foot view, pan out to figure out how we can solve all of this. So we're going to talk a lot about missions and missions of our organizations and what we're fundraising for. We're going to talk about culture, strategy, and actions. And that is going to be done through a lens of inclusivity, diversity, and making sure that we have everybody in the game. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and also kind of introduce how they're coming to this topic so that you know how to orient some of your questions or how they're framing their experience. So I would like to start with Eric. Eric, can you describe yourself and how you're coming to this conversation?
Thank you. Again, my name is Eric Ellis. I'm the president and CEO of Integrity Development Corporation. We're an inclusion and diversity management consulting firm out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Next year, we will be celebrating being in business full-time for 30 years. And I, in fact, am a second generation diversity consultant. So my father was one of the pioneers in this field. So my dad was a consultant. My mom was a preacher. You'll hear both of those in my voice. But we work with major corporations, government agencies, educational institutions, nonprofits, police departments, helping them to create people-centered workplaces. And that's one of the things that I have the honor of being able to do, is help organizations look at really, truly, what does it take from a strategic standpoint? What does it take from an educational standpoint to prepare your organization to be more inclusive? And I find that, unfortunately, one of the studies that I would draw people's attention to is Gallup did a study in 2017 of full-time workers around the globe, where they identified that 85% of full-time workers don't like their jobs and 75% don't like their bosses. So as I think about that, before we even start talking about inclusion and diversity, in many ways, organizations have a people problem. So if we're struggling with how to create environments that are welcoming to people in general, then how much more difficult is that going to be when we start talking about diversity and inclusion? And I think in this season that we're in with these twin pandemics, George Floyd's death, a lot of people are focused on putting out statements. But people are asking for more than what is your statement about Black Lives Matter. They're looking at your boards and your senior leadership teams. And so I come to this conversation from the perspective of inclusion and how do we do that in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Eric, so much. People-centered. So I know as we go a little bit forward, we're going to explore what that means. But it's really powerful because organizations are made of people. And if people aren't happy or don't have an orientation or aren't aligned, then how are you supposed to get the work done? I think that is extremely important to start, even before we start using the R word, talking about race. Great. So we'd like to go to Rita. Rita, can you introduce yourself and let folks know how you're entering this conversation?
Certainly. Hi, Hassan. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you to AFP-NYC as well. I'm Rita Walters. I'm the Vice President of Union Theological Seminary here in New York City, both of development and alumni relations. And I come to this work, this is my second career. I've led teams as a VP or CDO at direct service organizations like Catholic Charities, I've been in university setting, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, as well as VP for MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art and Development, as well as the CDO for the Washington National Cathedral in DC. And I come to this work, this is my second career. I spent the first 15 years of my career as an accountant and doing finance. And one of the things that you learn in finance is that if you want the math to work, then it takes all the numbers in the room. And I really try to bring that aspect to the work that we do and have people, you know, for me, it's not thinking outside of the box when you think of people of color, of course, but for others. And so how do we educate people to say, if you want your bottom line to matter, right? And and that I always say, no mission, no margin, no mission. So you must have resources. And if you're going to do that and maximize that, then you need all the people in the room and those who are not in the room, and you need to bring them along. So how can we do that in an effective way? And I think when leaders, whether it's presidents or executive directors, when they actually get to hear that, it really does change the tune. And I'll leave it there.
No, that is extremely excellent. Making the math work, talking about math. Nielsen does a lot of consumer data and understanding the buyer power of different communities, and understanding math, you need to know the numbers. Black shoppers spent $1.4 trillion in 2019, according to these insights, and they're projected to reach $1.8 trillion. And to your point, if folks are trying to make the math work and trying to make their margins and having a diversified portfolio, diversified revenue, I think understanding what's under those numbers and how to get access to them, especially if it's mission aligned, can make people's work easier if they put the initial efforts into getting that understanding. So I think framing this as a math problem is also hopefully a way to invite folks in if they aren't race people or they don't know diversity. I think that's a really great insight. Angelique, could you say how you're entering this conversation and what you want folks to know?
Sure. I'm Angelique Grant. I'm a senior consultant and vice president with the Aspen Leadership Group. ALG, we're a national firm. I'm located in South Florida, but we've been a virtual firm for years. Our area is executive search and consulting. And we're seen as like the go-to firm when it comes to diverse recruitment and retention and building inclusive cultures. We only work with nonprofit organizations. And for us, we're entering this from a different perspective because we've all been in those seats. We've sat as practitioners for over 20 plus years. For me, I've spent 26 years fundraising and leadership from Washington State, Princeton, University of Miami, and then some. And this conversation for me it's always been a part of what we've talked about in the industry, right? Now we're just putting a DE&I label on it. At first, it used to be the diversity conversation. Everyone kind of just like adjust in their seats about, okay, here we're about to talk about race. But it's more than that. It's about inclusivity. It's about being a part of it. It's about having a voice, right? And my area of expertise is taking a look at the body of literature, research as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And integrating it into the work of advancement. We are externally facing professionals. You have volunteers, donors, all of those individuals in which you're building relationships with, as well as your colleagues internally. So it's looking at it from a workplace environment of inclusivity, as well as your stakeholders and your constituents completely. So just recently, I published a book, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Advancement, a guide to strengthening engagement and fundraising through inclusion. It's the first book in our space. So looking at it again from a philanthropic volunteer standpoint, standpoint where we cover recruitment, retention, campaigns, building a pipeline, right? And you have to start with awareness and moving towards action. So today's conversation, it's not just going to be about conversation. What do? We're going to start talking about action, things that you need to take a look at both as an individual, as a team, and as an organization, and then applying it with varying levels of accountability. Happy to help you walk through that when we break out into our groups. I've worked with a lot of employee resource groups, DEI committees from across the country, Planned Parenthood, The Ohio State University, Washington State, and then some. And I'm also a certified unconscious bias trainer and recruiter as well. So where am I coming from? Definitely the core of this conversation. But at the end of the day, it's moving it to what are we going to do about it and true behavioral change.
Angelique, thank you so much for that. Research to support advancement and research that leads to action, I think is really powerful. Digging into data definitely matters, and how do you use what we know to get to where we want to get to is really powerful. So I guess I need to introduce myself a little bit, like why am I in this conversation? Yes, I've led organizations before, and I guess that makes you the fundraiser in chief, because ultimately there's none to lead if there's no money to run the organization. I did my dissertation on understanding Black philanthropy comparatively to similarly healed white colleagues. So I looked at Black giving across socioeconomic status and compared it to white giving across socioeconomic status, and figured out what you can see. I'm going to leave in suspense. What was the answer? The answer for sure was, it's interesting. Folks who have more socioeconomic status, more wealth, more education, more income are more likely to give. It was a yes or no quantitative data type of a thing. It wasn't a qualitative piece, but it was interesting looking at informal philanthropy. So the likelihood of a Black person to give to a family member or a friend. The Black folks in that panel study were more likely than their white counterparts in the same socioeconomic status to give. And so what was the story in that? Hypothesizing, number one, because of wealth gaps over history, that people of color sometimes have other obligations, other liabilities on their balance sheet. And so they're giving to family members and friends to kind of replace the wealth that isn't available to families as a whole. But then there's also another story about philanthropy happening almost natural within communities of color in different ways that aren't in what I'll call the nonprofit industrial complex. To people who might be considered poor or not having as many resources, a lot of nonprofits never formally ask them. And so what happens when you don't ask somebody, you're not going to get money. So it's a conversation about engaging community, and then looking at the long history of philanthropy that, in particular is in the African-American community that fueled and funded civil rights, the tremendous generosity that you see from the Black, billionaires coming forward, Robert Smith, Oprah, Tyler Perry, the list goes on. Kwanzaa Jones, who went to Princeton University like myself, her and Jose made a $20 million gift. Well, how do we look at people of color differently and understanding how to engage them? And so I want to ask the first question to Eric, which is a larger one. Like, how do we get some of these narratives about people of color, about their ability to give or not give? Or like, how do we get into this place where folks felt it was easy to overlook the wealth and the generosity that might be in spaces of color? Eric, are you mute or no?
I've seen 1,000 people do that, right? I think that we really start with how we perceive people. And I think that it's so important for people to recognize that all people have bias, and that the majority of our biases are unconscious. And so we tend to then layer that onto our views of diverse people. I served on a board in Cincinnati, and I was successful at recruiting Bishop T.D. Jakes to join that board. And I was so excited about that. But many of the corporate leaders were not familiar with Bishop Jakes. And he came into this space with this huge idea of how to raise some funds, but they were used to encouraging people to, to get your friends that can be high dollar donors, and that's the only model that they were familiar with. And he suggested that he would possibly do a television show from this museum and look for small donations from African Americans around the country, if not around the world. And they couldn't see that. And eventually, because they didn't really respect him, he just moved on. And so I think that there's so often we see people that are utilizing the language of inclusion and yet remaining exclusionary because we don't really see the opportunity. I'll share one last story. I was doing a seminar with a group back when we were doing things in person a number of years ago. And after I got done with this presentation, this wonderfully balanced presentation around diversity and inclusion, and I was so excited and so positive, one of the board members asked me after I completed what I presented, "So what do you people want?" I mean, I was like, oh my, what do you people want? Well, it's not really about what I want. It's about what your organization needs. And your organization needs a diversity of people, not just of color, but even generationally, to be willing to make the choice to invest in your organization. And I think that we have to really look at how interested are we in truly being inclusive. And that doesn't mean just inclusion events. That doesn't mean inclusion activities. That means really welcoming people into the space and making room for them.
Yeah, I would actually, if I
Go right
may,
ahead, please.
Yeah, I would actually add to that we also need to look at the history of how we got here in this profession. Right. So in 2018, AFP did a study. I think AFP Global did a study. There are about 31,000 people in the field that's frontline fundraisers. Less than 10% of those folk are people of color. And if you think about the history of how this profession evolved, it evolved out of mostly ladies that lunch. So whether it's a auxiliary for a hospital, and they had a store and they raised money, etc. So like, in many ways, like recognizes like. So it's up to us, those of us who are of color in the field, to say that's not the only narrative, because no one is a single narrative. But the education, and Eric, you make such a great point, is to really try to expand that for folk. And also, they need to also understand, I know a lot of people are not early adopters and they want proof of concept. I've had, since we're storytelling, I love that part. And that's our work, right? We tell stories and we hope we inform people who are generous and have capacity. So there's a story that I remember where the person said to me, I'm hesitant. I would hire a person of color, but I'm a bit hesitant because I want that person to be successful. I'm really rooting for her. But if she's not successful, then that's it. I can never, ever go to bat for another person of color. Mm. Now, that's ridiculous. That's right. Like saying, I would hire someone who wears glasses. But if that person fails, I can never, ever hire a person who doesn't have 20/20 vision. It's crazy. So we have to sometimes just, sort of call people on and just repeat what you just heard, and they get to actually hear it again. And they're like, oh wait, that wasn't quite what I meant. No, of course, it's ridiculous. And people are leaving this field in droves. And this is not just people of color. Our white and white non-Hispanic colleagues are running for the hills because of some of the treatment that they too get in this particular field. So we have to do a much better job as a profession to really train and invest in our colleagues. And when we leave out colleagues of color, we're doing ourselves a huge disservice.
That is so powerful. So the two of your comments together make me think about a couple of things. Number one, don't miss out on your blessing, like TD Jakes might say,
Right.
literally, there are blessings that are delivered to us by different people and different ideas. And by being inclusive, you get a chance to open yourself to opportunities that and doors that might have never been open to you. And to your point, in thinking about TD Jake's model, Howard Dean, when he was running his campaign early on, got the notion of like a lot of smaller gifts that broaden the base. And we broaden the base, you make the case for support. And that makes larger donors even more excited about what you're doing. And you've seen, candidate after candidate utilize that. Princeton University, I'm class of 95. They got me involved in annual giving. I was a co-class agent for the last 10 years. And I learned that, yes, you had, the critical few in leadership and special gifts, but they also had, the top line number that they wanted to get, but the participation number also mattered too, because they wanted to make sure that the base is as wide as possible. Because in the base, you might have the future pipeline, you might, and motivate the top givers. There's so many ways of engagement that really matter. And so, your comments really spark, and I think a lot of thinking that goes to math and strategy, not just about, race. Another point that I think in general is kind of the ground rules, like this is not a conversation about shaming people or who can be the most woke or having the exact right language. A wise person told me, you need to be tough on institutions, but kind to people. And I think this is only going to move if people who work within the institutions are kind to each other and work towards the best intent and try to move the needle forward. Angelique, one of the themes was, should you have a person of color asking a wealthy white donor for, gifts? Is it having people of color in major gift seeking, putting them at a disadvantage and making them uncomfortable? How would you react to that line of questioning?
Well, I wanted to touch base on what you were saying first, and then I'll answer that if you don't mind. I agree with, the fellow panelists as it relates to the giving of those of color. Those diverse groups have always been giving along the way and at larger levels. It's not at the charity level, right? Charity is like putting something in a bucket, dropping something in the bucket. Philanthropy is supporting a vision, right? And we've done that. The African American Museum in Washington, D.C. is an example. They had a $520 million campaign, right? 74% of all of the $1 million gifts came from people of color, right? You have tons of giving circles across the country. The Latino Community Foundation in California is a great example of powerful giving and with diverse communities. And some of the names that you've been hearing, even, you've mentioned Robert Smith, he's been giving very quietly until Morehouse, right? Then that became a big thing. But he's been giving these $1 million gifts all along quietly. There are tons of people out there, even the folks on this call. We've all have our stories. We've been asked or not asked. It's about creating a team that's culturally competent with cultural humility at the core of it. Because when we're looking at what we think in our minds, going back to the bias that Eric had mentioned of what philanthropy looks like, right? You're going to come up with this demographic of a straight white male, right? But if you go beyond that and you're visiting and you're building a solid relationship and you're getting to know the person and you're listening to what they're saying and building trust, then that's where that voice kind of comes into play. You ask about having a diverse fundraising team. Yes, having a diverse team is important because they're bringing that cultural contribution, not cultural fit to the table, if you may, right? Because we like to hire people who are the right quote unquote fit when it's your cultural contribution. It's opening your eyes to how we're talking to varying people with backgrounds and protocols and what's motivating them and getting to the nitty gritty of it all, right? Mary Beth Gassman and Nelson Bowman, they have research that kind of touches on the fact that people of diverse cultures and ethnic backgrounds tend to embrace, in many cases, and prefer to be cultivated by individuals of the same race and makeup, right? They go on to talk about how that by not including diverse leaders and volunteers to be a part of your organization, right? You don't see them growing within your organization, and you don't see them as part of part of leadership. They're not going to see themselves within your organization. So if they don't see themselves within the organization, then why is your organization different than any other? So as the demographics continue to change, right, both age, we're going to be a majority minority country in a few short years. You're going to be leaving volunteer engagement at the table and dollars on the table each and every year until you start changing that paradigm of inclusivity. And it's not about best practice, it's about better practices. Mm-hmm. Best practices got us to where we are now, right? By taking one thing and, oh, let's just plop it here and plop it there. No, it's very individualistic, and it depends on what the gap is on your team. You need to define diversity for yourself, and whatever diversity means to you, make sure that you have a holistic approach in terms of welcoming everyone to have a participation, whether it's volunteering or making a gift or sharing, how they see your mission impacting their community, both locally and globally.
No, that is so helpful. The whole notion of fit and people just getting comfortable made me think of the Harvard Business case, which is about the Space Shuttle Challenger, where there was a fit. A lot of folks fit in with one another and understood each other. There was dissenting or new information that could have been utilized before the Challenger went up and then ultimately exploded, that if folks would have integrated that thinking, you could have avoided groupthink. And sometimes you need more rigorous processes, because if people are just around you all agreeing, then you're missing some solutions that might be right in front of your face. So again, I guess we're not completely just talking about race, we're just talking about theories of like how to have rigorous problem solving and like how to solve the problem of raising millions or billions of dollars to support the causes that we care about. And I think that's really important. Eric, how do you create the space, the environment where folks can even begin to have these conversations of including difference? You talked about the workplace, and folks, aren't happy in general. They don't feel comfortable. So talk about a culture where folks can feel open to contribute and bring their whole selves to the work. Because I assume if you're not bringing your whole self to the work, then there's no way you can really be inclusive.
Right. Thank you for that. I could just talk forever about this because I'm so passionate about this. Let me start here. First of all, we have to come into the real world to recognize that as human beings, we all have bias. And I believe that we have to destigmatize bias so that people can identify it within themselves, own it, and then work to reduce it. And I think that a lot of times we're having what I might even call token talk. We assume that there's two kinds of people. There's open-minded people, and then there's a few bigots in the world, and most of us are open-minded, and we're looking for the one or two bigots so we can eject them out of the organization. I think that we've got to really reckon with some of the challenges that we face. I would also say, if we look back to 2008, when the recession happened, organizations were decreasing people, and they were increasing the work on those that remained. And so what I see today is that we're in this world where in many ways people are overworked. I'm just going to say it. People are really busy. They're too busy. They're actually too busy to manage people. They're too busy to manage diversity. And so we have a bunch of individual contributors. So this notion of how do we get to know each other is going to present some challenges. I would identify one other thing that I think that I draw people's attention to. So you hear a lot of people talk about unconscious bias, but you may not hear a lot of people talk about how you reduce that. There are a couple of resources that I'll draw your attention to. Number one is a study that was done in 2012 at the University of Wisconsin that looked at how do you bring down unconscious bias in measurable ways. And I'm going to reduce their research to 3 steps. They basically said, step number one, you have to increase your awareness of inequity. how inequity manifests itself in the world and how inequity manifests itself in your organization. Now, for many of you, that may be a stopping point right there, like inequity, how does that exist? So we've got to do that. Number two, then we have to increase our empathy and concern. So it's one thing to be aware, it's a whole nother thing to be concerned about it. And then step number three is we have to develop strategies and techniques to help us to reduce that. If you're looking for something even more current, there's an article that was done in Harvard Business Review, it's September, October edition, that basically says the same thing as that research. They talk about sort of racial equity in the workplace, and there are 5 steps for how to bring that down. So I think that that's one of the things that we really have to look at is seriously, how do we work to create that culture that is inclusive? And if you want one more thing that should get everybody's attention, look at what's happening at Google right now with Dr. Timnit Gebru. She's a noted researcher who they fired, and she's just a real leader. And I'll tell you that I think they may have drop kicked $500 million off the cliff with the action that they took against someone of color who was basically challenging the culture. I think, Rasan, that's one of the difficulties for organizations is being open to being challenged in ways that will ultimately help them to become stronger.
Could I add to that?
Please do.
Great. Oh, yeah. That's Patricia Devine's work at the Prejudice Lab at Wisconsin. Exactly. Ways in which you're going to break biases. The thing about what we're not seeing is people working with themselves first, right? Because if you're not self-aware, you can go out and try to find these quick fixes and these formulas like, oh, we just want solutions. That's that human behavior. Tell me what's a microaggression. Just give me a list of all of them so I won't do it. No, right? How are your biases and your microaggressions showing up in yourself as an individual, right? Or being aware of them. Then understanding where it shows up in your behavior and then moving towards that change. You're not going to get there overnight. It's going to take time. It's taken us 401 years to get here in some instances. It's not going to happen in a fiscal year. But if you start practicing that, it becomes something that is continuous. We like to throughout these, we need to be culturally competent, right? That's the other piece, knowing the difference between being culturally competent and cultural humility, right? Cultural competency is grounded in this intellectual sort of knowledge, which means that you got it. Now you can work with other people. It's been solved, right? It's an acquisition. It's a technical term. But when you start talking about cultural humility, there's a difference because it focuses on self-humility rather than acquiring this sort of state of awareness, right? And it's about greater emphasis on going back to empathy, like Eric is sharing, right? Greater emphasis on this lifelong commitment, and it clearly evolves over a period of time. So if you have a team who's more self-aware of their behavior, internally and externally as an organization, you will see that transition take place as you then become, and I'm not saying it's all solved in workshops and or trainings, that's not it. That's a part of it, but also developing a strategy, hiring others who can bring about that transition and transformation on your team, and start being committed to practicing that behavior change.
That is so helpful. Rita, I'm going to go to you in a minute, but I wanted to do a little more of lifting up points or things that I heard. So Eric talked about the study in 3 steps, like looking for inequity. For me, in true action in an organization, that's like environmental scan, looking at the data, collect data, actionable, do it. And when you're collecting data, you need to have the demographics that are on top of it so that you can parse out the things that are opportunities for you to grow and find disparities. Because if you're not recognizing difference, then you can't find a disparity. So you have to go in with that lens intentionally. Number 2, which is the number 1 thing that I wrote, plugging a piece that I did for the Chronicle on Philanthropy, in talking about tackling race in your organization, you can stop and breathe. Look at yourself, expel the shame, expel the pieces that are making you uncomfortable, have the humility, as Angelique was saying, because it's about you, but it's about 400 years of history. This didn't happen because of you. But Ta-Nehisi Coates said, Beyond the World and Me, it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility, right? And so in that duality, don't take the shame on, but it's this work that needs to be done. And it's not necessarily fair, but it's work. If you're going to move forward, we got to do. And then the strategy piece, which is making sure that you're making plans and having an approach based off of what you've seen and being able to get yourself together, that you're not bugging out. And we know that we manage what we measure. If it's not measured, it's not managed. So making sure it's a part of our plan. So Rita, I'm going to go to this to you in general. Your experience as a person of color in fundraising, what are some of the things that you've seen that have been done that are successful? Talk, I guess, from a personal experiential place. I'll be frank, 45 years of the Citizens Committee for New York City being in existence, I'm the first Black CEO. And they did it, and it was intentional, including me in the room as the face and leadership of this organization. Right before the pandemic, they didn't know the pandemic was coming, but it has transformational implications and how we raise money, how people see us, and what the narrative is. But I will tell you, I go into tons of rooms, whether I was a grant maker or whether I was a nonprofit executive, that I'd be one of a few people of color that you can noticeably tell by the melanin in my skin. And so can you talk about being that person in those rooms, Rita, and getting the work done and what it takes to be successful in a way that's being kind to people, but maybe being a little critique on institutions?
Yeah, of course. I would love to talk about that. I want to just mention there's so much rich conversation happening. I feel like I'm ping-ponging. I bet some of our audience may feel the same way, because it's like, wait, I want to respond to that. Wait, I want to respond to that, because it's such good. So thank you. I'm learning so much as well. I want to just speak just really quickly on the side of presidents of institutions, right? And what vice presidents of development are up against. So the tension for us, just in general, around all of this unbiased training, et cetera, is that we are under so much, presidents are under, and Rasan, you can speak to this as a CEO, you guys are under so much pressure to make your budgets, right? To live out that vision, pressure from the board and otherwise, right? And you're right, what gets measured gets, what was the expression? What
you manage what you measure.
Right, what you manage, yeah, get it. Thank you for that. So you're under so much pressure to do that pressure sort of rolls downhill to the VP. So when we want to actually, quote unquote, hire a non-traditional candidate, right? It's like that person came to me and said, well, I want to do it, Rita, but you don't get it. This is blah, 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 right? I can never do it again. So we have to also change the culture is not just in the development department. The culture is changing, the culture is in the entire institution, including the board, including to say this work is not transactions. This is not a sales job. I've been on the plane before the pandemic so many times, and every time you sit down, a person would say, hey, so what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a fundraiser, and they literally recoil. I mean, like, I can never do that. Like, what? Or I can never beg people for money. Neither could I. And that's not the work that I do. So, so we have to sort of dispel some of these myths. But at the end of the day, people, like, we have to be held accountable to the president that has to come in with a certain budget, that has to, because he or she is saying that, you know what, I am mission driven. And in order to live out my vision, I need these resources. I have these multiple streams of revenue, but development is no longer the icing on the cake, especially at universities, right? We're no longer, it's not like, well, we'll get all the money and revenue from tuition, and then whatever you do is like icing on the cake, maybe I'll put in a gymnasium. That's not the case. We have many more students who need our resources and support and philanthropic engagement in order to, and these are students of color, right? And organizations that support people of color that need those resources. So I'm super passionate about this work, but I understand the struggle that we're up against and how to live within that tension. And yet, we still must do this. So, there's sort of answers all around here to answer. So now just to talk really quickly about my personal experience. So this is my fourth leadership role where I run my own shop. And in each case, without exception, I've taken over this role from a white male. So the institution, I've been the first Black woman to, be the VP or the CDL. And I will share one, and I love all of the organizations that I've been part of. Otherwise, I would have never sort of thrown my name my hat into the ring. But yet we can still disagree with folk we love, right? And we can still hold them accountable. So one particular organization where I became the CDO, we have our first development committee meeting, and I start in the summer. We have our first development committee meeting in the fall. This particular organization, most people were gone over the summer. So the development chair, other than reading my resume, seeing my name and speaking to, this is before Zoom, really, and speaking to me over the telephone. When we met, he was going to come to my office, sort of just after Labor Day. And he older gentleman, white, he walks in and he said, "Oh, hi, I'm looking for Rita Walters." And well, that would be me. And he said, I wouldn't have hired you. I guess he thought it, but he actually said it. And I'm certain in my heart of hearts that he did not mean to say what he thought out loud. And I said, well, I'm just glad it wasn't only up to you. Now, we had a very contentious working relationship throughout my tenure there, right? It got better to a certain extent, but what actually was sort of how it ended, we raised the most money for that institution in recent memory of that institution. I will say that I've been invited back for a number of occasions, especially sort of of occasions that are of national prominence, as a sort of a bow to, or a head nod to say, just thank you again for the work that you've done when you were here. And you changed us with your enthusiasm and tenacity and stick-to-itness in a way that's super meaningful. We did it with a staff that was the most diverse. I had an amazing, amazing colleague who, when I came, she was doing data entry. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing data entry. This woman had 2 masters. She had come to this country. English was a second language for her. And when I said, there was a consultant who was there in place of me before I came in, and I would continue to meet with that consultant periodically. So I said, oh, I'm going to actually promote this person actually to my number 2. And I did this within 3 months. And she said to me, I think that's a major mistake. You really can't understand her. And I said, well, you need to listen more carefully. So we just have to and I can go on and on about things like that. And I think the biggest misconception with our work, the biggest misconception is that fundraising is about the money that you bring in. It's only one part of the work that we do. And if you don't know the fundraising cycle, I suggest you look it up, right? But I'll be kind and tell you what it is, right? So it's identification, right? It's qualification, it's cultivation, solicitation, and then stewardship. You need to spend 90% of your time on cultivation. If you're going to build a house, then it has to have really good grounding for that house. And cultivating our prospects and our friends and our suspects is where the work happens. And it happens, our donors, and regardless what organization I've represented, our donors are amazing, amazing people, really thoughtful, intellectually curious, want to understand the life of the mind, want to understand the world around them. And they have not had much experience with people who look like me and people who look like many of us on this call. And they're curious about that. They're not, it has not been my experience that they've been afraid of it, by and large. And I think it's our role then to say, we have to be vulnerable. We have to be willing to be vulnerable. And when vulnerable, oh, I love what Angelique talked about, humility, right? Cultivating a culture of humility. That's exactly what it is. That we, and who, this is my personal opinion, but who does that better than people of color? Given the 400-year of history, right? Just in this country, and not to mention all the other countries that people of color come from to come to the US, and what that rich history is really, really like. So bringing that sense of empathy and community to folk, to many times folk who have not had that experience, it not only changes your life, it changes theirs as well. And they are hungry for that in a really powerful, powerful way. And I think if we open ourselves up to that, it will change organizations for the better. And we will not have to go with our hat in our hand year after year, getting on and off a wheel. And one of the things I've been able to articulate in all the, and I've applied for in 20 years, and I changed professions 20 years ago. And this is not to exaggerate. In 20 years, I've applied for one job in development. And an Asian American woman hired me. She's the first person I met when I moved to Baltimore. To this day, she remains my dearest friend. I've got to hire her twice after that initial hiring that she hired me. So we've been partners in this work for a really very long time. I'm trying to bring her to New York. You know, she has a kid in high school. So if she's listening in, like I'm right, hopefully soon. So if we can, if we can really do this work and really have the humility and the grounding, and then allow the presidents to give us the space to do this, we can change things. We can really change things. And you will never have to apply for a job, I guarantee you.
No, I think fundraisers should never have to apply for a job, because like being able to be a relationship maven, a relationship expert that has people close enough so that you can really, after they've been qualified, cultivate and solicit, and then maintain relationships. That's what it's all about. My fundraising mentor, to a certain extent, I talked about doing 10 years of annual giving for Princeton. Big time shout out. My class 1995, even though we missed our 25th reunion in person, shattered the record for annual giving. We raised $12 million last year, cultivating that. And I mention it because I'll name check her, Kathy Weber, who is in charge of our campaign. She started working with me and my buddy as co-class agents after our 15th reunion, and just taught me the ropes of the game. And she was in charge of making sure we raised $12 million. But her first job in development was at Princeton. She got recruited because she was actively involved in her community as on her school board. And she made some relationships, helped raise her family. And then now she's helping to raise money at $12 million clips, at least for at least my class. And I say that story, she is a white woman, but this is a relationship business. And if you only see talent in certain places and you don't know how to identify who's great at relationships, who's great at having ease of conversation, who's good at their research, who's organized, you're going to miss a lot of folks who can be potential colleagues of yours and working in this field. So it's not just like who went to the fundraising school. I like this. Like the ask is kind of in some ways the easiest part, and people don't like making ask for money, but a lot of people are really great at relationships. And you're talking about folks making a way out of no way. A lot of communities of color, they've only existed because of their relationships with one another. Another plug for my dissertation. The informal philanthropy comes because of relationships and not just helping out folks in your immediate family, but other extended kin. And utilizing those skills for institutional goals, I think, is really important. The other piece I'm going to say is understanding the business model. These presidents of universities and CEOs are catching hell if they don't understand what the business model is. And so being in full partnership of understanding how money's supposed to come in and where it comes in is such a big deal. So I want to plug, if folks aren't lighting up the questions, this is supposed to be participatory. Call and response. We are in the service and we need y'all to let us know what you're thinking. I mean, we got a lot. We can go on and on, but this is really
Let me
hopefully
throw
to
one
be
thing
about
out
conversation.
there, son. Let me throw one thing out there. Who set us up with this? I mean, my goodness, we're just getting started. I mean, we could go 2 days straight with this panel. I mean, we could go 2 days straight. But I want to share this.
I'm gonna go ahead and raise my hand on that one. All right, go ahead.
So let me say this, that one of the things, so nonprofits are in need of breakthrough ideas. Organizations in general are always at risk of getting stuck. We know that because of COVID-19, people are predicting that 30% of businesses will not return. I'm saying all of that to say that we know that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams, and that adding diversity to your organization doubles the probability of finding the right solution. So as organizations look at strengthening themselves, in other words, it is in an organization's self-interest to look at how do we diversify our staff in ways that are meaningful, because people are not coming into organizations that are doing this work in a token sort of way. And I think that trust is a big part of what's needed here, relationships and trust.
Yeah.
That is so great. There's a question in the chat. I'm sure there's also flow off of what Eric said, but want to say in general, also want to wrap in, what can folks lower down in the hierarchy, folks that are like, you know, line level staff that are interested in this, how can they manage up? How can they surface up these ideas?
And I'll jump in on that because it was also a follow-up with Eric. You know, now, like, okay, diversity is counting heads, inclusion is making heads count, right? So if you're going to have a diverse team just for the sake of it, make sure that it counts in its totality, right? Because you have the representation, let's think about the participation. So for the person who asked the question, I don't know if you have an inclusion council, I like to call them all inclusion councils, but a group of individuals within your organization is going to help take the lead on DE&I and then help the organization be accountable for DE&I, right? And whether that's developing or recreating your prospect research strategies, whether it's taking a look at all of your volunteer boards and assessing the diversity that exists within it, developing that grid, looking at gender, geographic location, background, all of that, right? And then starting to recruit and engage communities who may be interested in joining your board or volunteering for your organization as a result of it, right? Because those inclusion councils come together and they help develop the overall strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion. You all have them, it's the DEI committees, et cetera. So I made a comment about awareness to action. And for us, it's when you start with awareness, I've talked about personal self-awareness, organizational awareness, pretty straightforward. It's take a look, then it's going to assessment. That's like step 2, assessing where it's showing up, where you need help. Is it equitable hiring and or compensation? Is it showing up as it relates to who's being assigned to someone's portfolio? Assessing if it's your hiring process and anti-bias strategies, right? And then the third step is, where do you want to be? What do you want to look like? That's aspiration, right? We aspire to do a better job as it relates to diverse giving and diverse audiences. Create that both internally and externally. Develop that action plan with measurables. We've talked about measurables. If it's increasing your frontline fundraising team by X percentage in the first year, develop that measurable. Is it to reduce your turnover rate? Because it costs approximately $125,000 to replace a major gift officer. That was calculated by the Chronicle of Philanthropy back in 2012, right? So you're losing money by having that revolving door moving through and throughout your organization. And then also assess your culture, right? Understand what people are thinking and why they think the way they do, both your colleagues in the workplace as well as your volunteers and donors. And then develop, after you develop that plan, Then make yourself accountable, benchmark it, celebrate those successes, and keep the rotation going so that you have an ongoing dialogue that won't stop, right? People may get tired, if you may, of hearing about DE&I, but I'm going to be quite frank, it's not going to go anywhere, right? It just depends on how you're emitting your energy. And being very methodical, work smart, not hard with it, right? And try not to take off all the bits and pieces of it. Take it each step at a time. 3 measurables for, let's say it's recruitment and retention is one. Let's say the third, or one's recruitment, one's retention, and the other is donor and volunteer engagement. Develop 3 to 5 goals each and every year for your team, and that's a great way to get started. And if you have them, revamp them, because maybe they're not the right goals for you at this point in time.
That is so helpful. Going definitely back to what's measured is managed. If managers and leaders have inclusive goals that are not side projects, but at the center of the way they're evaluating success, I think that is really, really the key. There's a question about, how to prioritize spending budgets to get this work done. I would say even before, if you don't have a red cent, organizations can do a lot by having the individuals who are involved, and it can start with an employee resource group or a group of folks that the coalition of the willing, having like learning goals and reading and sharing with one another, how inclusive language, inclusive things to think about, understanding different communities. And the actions are, number 1, educate yourself. Number 2, be reflective. And then number 3, take action by just reaching out to other human beings, other people who don't look like you, and engage in conversation. If you do it with intention, you don't need a rule book to talk to folks. If you're intentional and being authentic, then people will see it. And then from there, you can figure out some of the deeper things. But I'd love to get people's opinion around implicit bias training versus anti-racism. Which one do we need? Both. I feel that that's definitely Eric's wheelhouse, but I love other folks too.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, let me give you a perspective. The research says that when we start talking about creating inclusive organizations, 65% of our effort is oftentimes put on fixing people. But 67% of our success comes from fixing our broken systems and processes. So I would say to you, now let me go back and say to you, if your organization is struggling with inclusion, you're not sure you want to do it, sit it out. Just sit it out. You don't have to do this. You can just sit it out and see how that works for you. So I think we need to take the pressure off of ourselves. Let's, free ourselves from the pressure. We don't have to do this. But if you want to do it, then you really need, there was a 40-year meta study of diversity training over 40 years. They identified 2 things that made a difference. The one was perspective taking. In other words, you need to engage in gaining perspective from people. I believe that you need diversity, inclusion training, and race training. I think you need as much education as you can, ongoing education. The second thing that moved the needle was really developing challenging action plans. And so organizations that really engaged in perspective taking, they drove up their empathy, they drove down their unconscious bias, and those that engaged in challenging action plans, I would offer one for you, the 4 pillars of inclusion. I'll just say these real quick because you'll be able to go back and look at it through the tape. Pillar number 1 is building a strong foundation, making sure that your leaders are engaged. Pillar number 2 is strengthening your internal structures, looking at your I&D learning, looking at your recruitment and development, looking at your processes and systems. Pillar number 3 is looking at strengthening your external structures, looking at your multicultural marketing, your supplier diversity. And then pillar number 4 is measuring results and establishing accountability. So those 4 pillars is what it really takes to build out a more comprehensive strategic plan around inclusion.
That is extremely helpful. We have a couple of questions. Number 1, how can I as a manager be supportive of fundraisers of color? I want to say it's a thing, but before I toss it out, I would definitely say give the fundraisers of color opportunities, sponsorship and mentorship. Don't say, okay, you're the person of color, so you do all the person of color stuff over in the person of color corner. That is not the established corner per se for your organization. You're giving them the Herculean task of doing what y'all haven't been able to do for decades. So include them in the mainstream stuff, so to speak, and then include yourself in the hard stuff that you want them to help you with too. But that's my first thing. But I want to know, Rita and Angelique, if you have any other comments to that.
You're exactly spot on. Absolutely. And I think what I would add is I try to remember in my own leadership is that we grow people, not grass.
Right.
And, really sort of focusing on that to recognize that so many people come from a diverse background to this work, right? Black folk, white people, Hispanics, et cetera, and they're bringing something of value and look for the good. Because if you can really focus on looking for the value add in that person, then that can go across the spectrum of all of your donors who are within every portfolio. And many of us can sort of, dance from one, like you said, Razan, it's not just, okay, here's the Black person, here's all the Black people and try to repair that relationship, right? It's everyone, because you bring something unique of value to the organization. And just look deeper. And I assure you that you will find it and you will see the humanity of that person. And it's that humanity that really propels this work forward. Again, it is not a sales transaction. It really is the work of transforming lives begins with each individual, because you never know how that individual philanthropist will respond, because you don't know that person's story. And it may take a person who looks like me and have my background or experience to really help them bring out their story and for them to say, this is what I want to support. They've been able to make a case that's so strong for a support that's so strong. I too am Union. I too am WNC. I too am Micah. I too am Hopkins. I too am Princeton, etc. So
no, I too am. Those campaigns are such a big deal, because when you're inclusive and institutions that weren't built for us but now are including us, and that I too am Princeton is, like, for me, has been such a powerful thing. I'm my class president right now for my alumni class. I did annual giving. Just the transformative experience of all of that has been game changing, from bridging different communities. So we're like almost at time, but Angelique, I want to give you a question and give you a chance to also comment in general. Following what Angelique said about research indicating that people of color donors prefer to be engaged by people of color, nonprofit staff and boards is the same. Apply for white, wanting to engage white folks. I also want to answer a little bit of that before I toss it to you too. We are in the moment of the twin pandemics, like I said before. Maybe in the past, white folks were comfortable just talking to white folks, but shifting demographics, the way this world is going, if folks aren't fighting against the arc of where this country and society is going to being more inclusive, they're going to probably want to be a little bit more inclusive in their lives and have opportunities to live a lot of their values that they're proposing. So I think denying white donors an opportunity to see a plethora and diversity of folks, soliciting them, stewarding them, still cultivating them, I think can be extremely powerful. And I think one of the reasons why people of color donors want to see folks of color in those institutions, because otherwise they don't trust the institutions. These institutions before haven't been made for us. And all of a sudden you're gonna have someone that didn't build something for you, asking for your money and taking it, you're gonna trust them to do something with it. You wanna see who's back there that I can trust and give us some kind of validation. So, it's not a reverse racism, can only Black people ask Black people or can only white people ask white people. It's more about like, how are we gonna get this done together? And like, how do we create cross-pollination places? One last thing I'll say before getting back to you, Angelique, I'm sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. People of color and the folks who have been otherized in this country have spent so much time studying the dominant culture that we know it like the back of our hand. Dominant culture does not necessarily spend so much time in the space of the others. You know, do a personal audit. When's the last time you've been in a worship service where you were in the minority? When's the last time you've been in a restaurant, you look around and you were the only ones? I'm sure if you ask, you know, a woman going to the boardroom, or a Black person just showing up at work on a very everyday basis, or a Latino coming in, you know, to certain places of authority, they'll say that, you know, yeah, we had to celebrate being the one and the only or the first, but the truth is on the other side. With shifting demographics, it's going to change a little bit. So I think folks need an opportunity to engage the new inclusive world that we're going to be a part of. And that's why we have to have these cross-pollinated conversations. But I'm off my soapbox, Angelique.
2 days.
What was the question is what I want to ask you, because you went into that and that really quick.
No, I mean, it was like, can white folks say, like, I just want white folks to ask me for money? If the research shows that Black folks, or, you know, people of color want to be solicited by people of color, I mean, is the same true on the other side of the coin?
Right. No, the thing about it is we have to take into consideration everyone is not the same person, right? In the same group. It just depends. The take home is have your team reflective of your constituents at the end of the day, because there may be another Black person there that we may not gel that well with, right? That's reality to it. But they do want to have that option. When we go as, you know, a Black woman to, let's say, purchase a car, I'm going to be quite frank, I do look for the Black salesperson, right? But they're all teed up in order, so it just depends on who you get, because you want to support your people. And I know certain groups do that. And when we're going to meet everyone where they are, we have to meet everyone where they prefer. And if there's no opportunity on your team to meet others on your team, regardless of the background, your ethnicity, et cetera, then there's just this, you know, one-way street, one dialogue, one voice that they're hearing and seeing. So no, we're not saying white people can only solicit whites and Blacks, only Blacks, et cetera. I want to be very, very, very clear. But what you can do is you can become an ally, which was put into the chat room, and also look at stop being in a non-racist stance, right? When you're non-racist, it's sitting in your neutrality. It's not calling it out. It's not saying, you know what, let's take it a step back. That's what an ally can be doing. Right? It's saying, what can we do differently to make sure that we are, you know, anti-racist, actively anti-racist, as opposed to just saying, I'm not prejudiced. Because at some point in time, if you were to take the IAT, the implicit association test, you're going to find out you're going to have a preference between either older or younger, right? Overweight, thin. So consider walking your team through that, talking through, I would say have some consultant and someone walk you along with you, because you can make some missteps and you don't want to take 2 steps back. But I say that to say, that's a way in which you can become actively involved in it. Learning more about your biases. Clearly, we've hit the nail on the head there, but don't sit in this non-racist sort of world and become more of an ally. It's a say-do ratio. If you're going to say something 50% of the time, do something 50% of the time. Don't say 80% of the time, and don't do anything about it, both internally with your team, your colleagues. How do I, you know, we create a volunteer group, develop these goals, and then sit back and say, oh, we just can't get there because it's too hard. No, you can get there each step of the way. Unravel it. One conversation, one redesigning and adaptation of your systems and your policies at a time.
So helpful. So Crystal, you need to chat me and let me know if I'm messing up, because we're going over time. But there was one last question I'm going to put out there, and then closing statements. How should organizations seek diverse talent outside? I'll go first. Go where you know folks are. I am a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, the Divine Nine, you know, historically Black Yeah, I see it. All that gang related stuff going on out there. No, go to organizations. There are a lot of Black civic organizations, Black churches, folks that are in leadership. I said the story of Kathy Weber. Find folks that are like doing fundraising in their communities, engage the people where they are. Folks who are alums and past recipients and past staff members of the organizations that you're raising money for, go to those affinity groups, go to those constituents, talk to them about who they know and invite them to the table. Like, becoming one of the few Black class agents at Princeton was like, my white Narani friend from school said, Rasan, I'm not doing this if you don't do it. And I was like, okay. And so he invited me to the table and it led me on a trajectory. If you're not including folks, then they're not going to see their part in their ownership of it. And you want them to feel that the success of the institution is their success, and that's how you engage them. Because again, really quick on Princeton, P-Raid, big parade, reunions, the oldest class go first, you walk down the hill. So you can literally see the history of Princeton unfold by watching P-Raid. All white men. Then you'll see, a person of color here and there, a couple of Black men. Then you'll see women and men. And then you see just all of the United Colors of Benetton coming down the hill, generation after generation. That shows you vividly that Princeton was not made for us. It wasn't made for Rasan, Khalid, Harris, and mine, but it is just as much mine as it's everybody else's. And when people believe that, they will go hard and they'll be passionate and they'll make the pitch for your organization. But I wanted to open up for closing remarks before we go on to whatever is next in the agenda. Let's start with Eric.
Well, I certainly have enjoyed the conversation. I would say that organizations have to just decide if they're really interested in being inclusive. If they are, then invest in that. I would say, and then become transparent around your objectives and your results. As you start becoming transparent around what you're trying to accomplish and what your results are, it will put the appropriate pressure on you. I think that you need to start with managing backlash in mind. And so you cannot go off in one direction of the pendulum and lose everybody as well. So there's this balance that I think that you have to be able to establish. But I think that where we are right now is that when people of color and diverse groups begin to do more of their own thing, I think that's actually going to put more pressure on organizations. There's a lot more competition out there. And so if you're not aggressively going after being inclusive, I think that you're going to be at risk.
Rita.
Yep, I would add to young people, I would say, find a mentor. And I don't mean, look someone up and say, like this person, I want them to be my mentor, but even they can be a mentor from afar. My second role in development, I found a woman who was super successful, and I modeled my fundraising work after her. And years later, I said, "Oh, you've been my mentor." And she said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I followed her work. I tried to, I looked at her professional feeds." And so we can do those things like that. I would say also to people who want to recruit people of color, take a look at women in academia. It shows the list of women who are moving from one role to a next. You would really get to see Black women highlighted there. Take a look at, there's another publication, I think it's JHBE, which is the role of Blacks in higher ed, and just reach out. Most of those folk are on LinkedIn. Just reach out and say, "Hey, I'm looking for a great, I want to recruit a person to do, to be a major gift officer. Do you have any possibilities in mind?" I answer those calls every single week. And I just have name after name. I have resumes, on file. Hey, I'll shoot you this resume over. And, and I've seen people get hired as a result of it. So I just think it takes a little bit of creativity to do that next step, but it's possible because there's a whole sort of army of us who are out there who are just waiting to place another hire within your organization as a person of color. And we're super happy to do that. It may be free labor on our part, but we are super happy to do that because it is just that important.
Angelique.
Yes, I agree with you on the mentors, mentees. Find mentors, mentees. If you're looking for some, I put in blacksinphilanthropy.com. Rita's a part of our group of leaders back in July. We made a stance to say, we are committed for change. We are committed to movement. Here's what we are going to do, and here's what we want you to do. So we're actually volunteering our time over a 7-month period to mentor emerging leaders in philanthropy, Black emerging leaders. So if you know of anyone who's interested, please share that with them, and you know, check out that website as well. I will also say, we as a firm, Aspen Leadership Group, we provide free career conversations for anyone who comes to us. So for us, that's how we've built our networks, because we're committed to it. We don't get paid to doing it. I told them, I guess we're going to go to heaven one day as a result of over 100 conversations we're having a week with anyone who comes to us. But we believe that when you go through a search process and you are not, let's say you don't get the position, to continue to cultivate the relationship. We are in a business of relationships. It's not putting butts in seats. It's about taking care of each other. It takes a village to do that. And that's a part of what we have committed to doing. When you look at your hiring processes internally, some talent managers or hiring managers are not even following up with candidates. They'll apply and it goes into a dark hole. And that's what builds your brand, right? So when you ask the question, what can you do? Take a look at your retention efforts and your processes and systems at a closer level. Follow up with candidates, get to know them, and develop relationships along the way, because if they're not available now, it may be something that may become available later. And then also look at the folks on your team. And creating that inclusive team is key, because we talk to each other in the industry. We all know each other. It's a small world, right? And we will call each other and say, well, I don't know if that leader is where you actually want to be. So get, leader up, man up, institution up, become a little bit more aware of your brand experience, right? Because you're going out there with these jobs and wanting to connect and have a diverse candidate pool, but are you really ready to hire a diverse candidate? That is the question you need to answer. And that is what you need to take a closer look at. And it's the why. Why your organization? Why now? We can help you do that. Others here on the panel can help you do that. But really, that's the take home. What is your brand experience, or what are your brand promise? And does it match your brand experience? Organizationally, internally, as well as externally.
No, that is so helpful. Eric brought it up and you brought it home. It's not about got to, it's about want to. But I will make the argument that if you don't want to, you might go the way of the dinosaur because demographics aren't going in your direction. But please, you don't got to.
Do you think?
Folks don't talking about emerging markets and trying to figure out investments over at China, and folks running around trying to learn Mandarin, trying to go to Africa, trying to go to all parts of Asia and Latin America. Folks who are trying to go after money are really trying to expand their portfolio. So, if you don't want to diversify your portfolio, it's up to you. But
Yeah,
and actually, as I'm drinking my yerba mate from Uruguay, but that's my whole South American Peace Corps experience. But that's a conversation for part 2 of this. Rita, you're about to say?
I was going to add to your point, because no longer are for-profits and nonprofits. There isn't a distinction any longer. You may have noticed that, for example, Tom's shoes, you buy one pair, Tom's will give away another pair of shoes for free. So that space of philanthropy is being blended. I, as a donor, can get the same warm and fuzzy feeling from buying a pair of Tom's shoes as I get to giving $100 to the United Way. And if we're not in that space, to your point, our donors are going to leave. And those spaces of multinationals are very, very diverse. And so so you're right, you don't have to, but it sure will help, I would say. Because there's a lot of competition. And I say to my staff all the time, we are in the attention getting business. If we cannot get your attention, then we cannot even have a conversation about values. And what we're really applying to is, how do we align our values with your values as a donor? And when we marry those two things together, then it really is like sprinkling fairy dust. But if we don't get that opportunity, they're going to buy a pair of Tom's shoes, and that's going to be.
And unfortunately, we literally have to stop here. I am heartbroken, as I am sure everyone is. Let me be the first to tell you this is not by mistake. Eric alluded to it, I think, when we had our first conversation about him joining the panel. And I believe, I'm just going to compound this and say, just looking at messages that have been sent to me directly, I'm going to ask all of you in front of every single person who's on this, if we can make sure we can make this a part 2 and part 3. I'm not going to go part 4, but if you're available, we will design it. But this conversation is not over. I'm basically trying to catch my breath. I'm so excited about what was shared here, and would like to thank all of you. We'd love to give you a round of applause. One, for the energy that you brought at 8:30 this morning. I'm not sure, that's my husband's phone ringing. Sorry about that. For the energy that you brought this morning, and for the lively discussion. Thank you so very much for that. I'm like pointing at him like, turn that off. Thank you so very much. Also, I'd like to say, just to wrap up and thank not only the panel and our fantastic moderator as well, the skill level, the information, the knowledge that all of you brought. I'm literally, I just want to share, these are my notes. I cannot do it. And I know I'm not alone.
Crystal, I want to make one point. Since you asked us in front of everybody, I want to also turn this back to you in front of everybody. I'd like the next time that we come together to open up the audience and really allow them to engage with us, because I think that will even make it richer. If we can see their faces, feel their voices and their hearts, I think that'll make it richer. And we don't even have to have a big agenda. We can have dialogue, and I think they will strengthen that.
Awesome. I think we just set the tone for part 2, dialogue. Got it. And I took notes on that too. So then I'd love to take the opportunity to thank our board. There's so many board members who were a part of making this conversation happen, who are here on this call. So you know how important this topic is to AFP-NYC. We say 100%, we do 100%. I love that comment. That I believe it was Angelique who may have said that, do X and say X. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. Again, we really appreciate your support. The Columbia School for Nonprofit Management, Management of Science. Thank you so much, Columbia University. We really appreciate you. The OR Group, Uman Consulting, and DM Pros. I'd also like to thank the committee who helped our executive director, Alex Owens, who's also a part of the planning of this, also to go in to punctuate how important this event was. Mindy Barham, who's also a board member, Jen Moore, board member, Pinky Vincent, board member, Erica West, board member, and Nora Keller. We could not do this without you, and myself, who's also a board member and the incoming chair of our IDEA committee. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you for the people who attended, our audience. We would have no one to speak to without you. So thank you for your interest in being a part of this conversation. I would be remiss if I did not mention that on the chat, if you open the chat, there's a little box with 3 dots off to the right-hand side. There were so many phenomenal resources in this chat. If you click that box, which I'm doing right now, you can literally click Save Chat, and it will save to your, I believe, to your downloads on your computer, but then that way you won't lose all of the phenomenal resources that were shared. We will also try to find a way, I'm speaking to Alex and Nora, we will also try to find a way to have these resources available and congealed in some kind of way that's digestible. That being said, we were supposed to have a breakout room. I see that there are quite a few people who are still here in the audience. If our panelists are still available for a few moments and can do the breakout room, we'd love to facilitate that and make that happen. So Nora, who's my wizard behind the scenes, or Alex, are we still able to do that?
Yes, absolutely. Just give me one moment and I will sort everyone into breakout rooms.
Fantastic. Thank you everyone so much again for being here. We sincerely appreciate you. And if you stick around for just a few moments, your screen may go dark and then you'll see a note saying you've been assigned to a breakout room, and you'll either automatically be placed in there or you can click that. And with that being said, after your breakout, I hope that you have a fantastic day. You have a wonderful holiday season and a great new year. Thank you so much from AFP New York City.